such an honor to be here today. I would like to thank Gina and Kate of the New Jersey Coalition Against Human Trafficking for their hard work in arranging this presentation. It is an important topic in the anti-trafficking field that receives so little attention. So this is a two-part series. Yesterday, we discussed identifying characteristics of familial exploitation, and today we are discussing the recovery process. Let's see. So I do want to take a moment to discuss the importance of mindfulness before we get started. So just as a warning, we are entering into a conversation about family exploitation. So this is a situation where family members who sell young children for sexual purposes and monetary gain here in the United States. So please take good care of yourself, being mindful if you start to feel emotional or numb. Some suggestions if you do start to feel this way: focusing in on your breath is helpful, engaging your senses through taste, touch, and smell, and last through movement. Take a break, stretch, or walk. These things can assist you if you become dysregulated. I also included NAMI's crisis line here in case you need to talk to someone immediately. That number is 1-800-273-TALK. So just to review a little bit from yesterday for anyone who missed it. Ooh, lots of movement. All right. I want to formally define familial trafficking as family members or caregivers selling their children for money, drugs, or something else of value. So this includes manufacturing and exchanging of child sex abuse material, also known as child porn, even if cash or other goods are not involved, as such material is valuable in its own right. So this is a low frequency, high impact crime. And what do I mean by that? Well, while research sizes tend to include very low sample sizes, these crimes have a pervasive impact on the individual, permanently altering their life, their development, and their life trajectory, making it one of the severest forms of child victimizations known to our country. So similar to yesterday, I want to start with a short discussion on adverse childhood experiences. It is agreed upon throughout trauma literature that the impact of trauma on the developing mind has lifelong consequences, and the impact of repeated instances of traumatic events have a cumulative effect, leading to a unique constellation of deficits across developmental domains. So trauma is defined as intense fear and threat to safety involving feelings of helplessness, extreme emotional pain, and distress. So what is traumatic to one individual may not be traumatic to another. It really just depends on, again, those feelings of intense fear and threat to safety, feelings of helplessness, and of extreme emotional pain. But prolonged and repeated instances of such trauma will disrupt neurodevelopment, which is your brain's development, leading to a range of dysfunctions in adulthood, including psychopathy. So this has significant implications for familial trafficking survivors, whose populations include prolonged exposure to extreme chronic abuse starting at a very early age while the brain is still developing. This population is at high risk for developing functional impairment and psychopathy as they literally grow up having to survive their childhood. This in turn impacts executive functioning, the capacity to regulate emotions, and the development of social skills. So I am a bit of a neurobiology nerd, so a discussion on trauma almost always includes these aspects for me. So in the brain, the neural pathways are wired for connection, and these pathways connect according to our life experiences, allowing for navigation of relationship, emotional regulation, and facilitation of cognitive functioning, such as memory, organization, and planning skills, as well as language development. For a child living in survival, this child will grow up in a prolonged state of fight, flight, and freeze, which is your body's natural response to danger. And this has very practical implications. So cognitively, which is your thinking skills, the child will struggle to focus and attend to tasks. It's just simply very difficult to attend to a task if you are constantly scanning the room for signs of impending danger. And this will carry over from the child's home and into benign environments like school. So the child has adapted to survive, and the locations matter not to this child's brain. These children may have difficulty consolidating memories, retaining information, recalling previously learned skills. And again, all this is typical due to a preoccupation with threats, whether the child's aware of it or not. So this preoccupation is automatic and typically unconscious. So socially, the child may be distrusting of adults, responding to the world as if in constant danger. They typically have a difficult time developing healthy peer relationships, as well as developing a strong relationship with themselves. A strong relationship with yourself tends to require awareness of your own preferences and strengths. And such an awareness is a luxury that survival simply does not afford. And not only does survival not afford that luxury, but the trafficking parent will actively discourage this by not allowing the child to hold views independent of their own. So emotionally, the child will struggle with dysregulation, shame, despair, and feelings of failure. They may have difficulty with change or uncertainty, as well as difficulty identifying nuanced emotional states. These individuals tend to be black and white thinkers, not understanding shades of gray. Behaviorally, the child may have a tendency to self-harm. They typically oscillate between aggression and unquestioning compliance. They may also struggle with impulsiveness, defiance, and being extremely withdrawn, preferring to remain as invisible as possible. And again, these are all protective mechanisms. So as you can see, trauma and learning differences such as ADHD will tend to present similarly and are often mistakenly confused. So I do want to take a moment to discuss self-harm. Why do so many survivors self-harm? Well, it's a maladaptive way to make themselves feel better. Sounds funny to those without self-harming experience and to those whose brains has developed neurotypically. But self-harming can actually release positive feeling chemicals in the brain. It makes these individuals feel better, not worse, and it can quickly become addictive. So we often wonder, how do people discover that self-harm feels good? Well, adolescents hear about self-harm from peers or in the media. But for many, self-harm will begin in childhood. with perhaps nail biting or scratching or hair pulling. These things might not qualify as self-harm for everyone, but for some, it might represent a very slippery slope. So an adult whose childhood is focused on survival will remain stuck in that survival state until they become aware of those maladaptive skills and learn adaptive skills. This takes an economic toll on the individual who is at high risk for suicide, substance abuse, increased encounters with law enforcement, and re-entry into trafficking through a more typical manner, like a boyfriend or a pimp. So just as you see the rates of such impairment in this population versus the general public, we see panic disorder jump from 2.7% prevalence to 85%. Sleep disturbances jump from 1.2% to 100%. Self-harming behavior rises from 5% to 70%. Aggression also rises from 7.8% to 40%. Difficulty forming and maintaining friendships increases from 30% to 70%. Suicidality also rises, goes from 1% to 50%. And instances of delayed recall for narrative events, meaning memories that have taken place, events of in your own life, that jumps from close to 0% to 75%. Such scary memories are typically only retrievable when the brain is in a calm state and able to function optimally. Yes. This trauma comprises our ability to engage with others by replacing patterns of connection with patterns of protection. Uh-oh. There it goes. Okay. Sorry, a little hiccup. All right. So let's define resiliency as something that is created. Oh, this is a slide I already went over. Created through predictable problem solving in a safe space rather than something one is born with or that develops as a result of surviving trauma. Perhaps my least favorite saying is children are resilient. So here, who has heard that one before? Because I certainly have. And unfortunately, resiliency is a learned skill. So just like anything else, it needs to be developed over time. Resiliency is not a bouncing ball. We don't bounce back from struggles without first learning how to. It's easier to imagine familial trafficking survivors as having been given a deflated ball and never having learned to bounce it, let alone having been taught how to make a basket. So immediate needs for survivors at any age is the creation of a safe and predictable space. This means stabilization of income, housing, and education. Then will come the long-term work to regulate and rewire the brain through connection with self and others. This typically involves therapy and also PTSD-specific medication. So just a note about therapy, as there are a lot of different therapy options to choose from, and the right therapy may be different for a survivor depending on their long and short-term goals. There is cognitive therapy, traditional talk therapy, EMDR, group therapy, and sexual abuse recovery coaching. Not to mention a whole slew of experimental or less common therapies. So no matter the type of therapy chosen by the survivor, it's important that the therapist understands their background and experiences, specializing in trauma recovery and sexual abuse recovery with experience in treating trafficking, trauma, or other forms of extreme abuse, such as torture or cultic memberships, that would be considered ideal. The worst is when a survivor traumatizes their trauma therapist during a session. This will typically set the healing process back a bit. So your approach when working with this population on any developmental domain should always be strength-based. And this might take some work. Oftentimes, these individuals have never had the luxury of pondering, what am I good at? What am I interested in? What do I like and what do I not like? So don't be alarmed if these questions throw the survivor into a stupor. Again, this might be the very first time they have ever considered such things. A trafficking parent simply does not encourage independent thinking, and this may go as far as inserting their own preferences for food choices or entertainment onto the child. So when familial trafficking survivors are asked, what helped you get through your trafficking experiences? The responses tend to be very similar. So what do you notice about these responses? You can enter that into the chat box if you would like, or just sit on your response for a minute. Some things that I have noticed is that sports, books, academics, and creative activities are helpful for a lot of survivors. They were helpful to these individuals, and these activities, they tend to be regulating and also distancing from the outside world. That means that a large portion of survivors, even with ADD or an LDD diagnosis, excel in school. In fact, for some, they may become obsessed with school as it's the only place of safety and validation. So I followed this by asking survivors what helped during the recovery process. So a lot of these responses are also very similar, involving books, movement, and community involvement, connection with spirituality and nature, therapy, and eventually helping other survivors on their own healing journey or spreading awareness about the issue can provide a sense of purpose to the trafficking experience and often to the life of the survivor. So what would go into your toolkit to help survivors become resilient? If anyone works with survivors, what do you use? So with a focus on normalization of emotional states, identifying stressors and triggers, meeting unmet needs, and teaching to skill deficits. So listed here on the left are tools survivors recommend, including community connection, regulating activities, crisis hotline support, books on PTSD and trauma, emotional support animals, virtual survivor groups, and sensory items. Perhaps my favorite is this last suggestion, which includes a host or surrogate family. Too often, survivors of familial trafficking regress during holidays as they are bombarded by images of happy families during this time of year. And this then increases their feelings of grief and isolation. A family that includes them in their celebrations can mitigate such holiday triggers. So also included here is a focus on taking care of yourself as a service provider. If you are helping traumatized individuals, it is just very easy to burn out. So the last statistics I saw on this were that individuals involved in human trafficking advocacy were able to remain advocates for about 7 years before having to focus on their own mental health. So creation of healthy boundaries with the survivor who might not have healthy boundaries, and knowing what you need to do to fill up your personal reward bucket can help extend the amount of time you are able to give to the survivor community. So in order to create such healthy boundaries, I suggest providing the survivor with a crisis number to call in the middle of the night or any other time you cannot be reached, depending on your personal boundaries, of course, but it's very common for a survivor to need crisis support in the wee hours of the morning. So a crisis number is good for that. So again, that number would be 1-800-273-TALK. So the impact of low resilience, this results in depression, re-victimization, demoralization, hopelessness, disconnection, fatigue, distress, and difficulty starting and finishing tasks. So next we'll talk about triggers, which is a word that has entered into our pop culture sphere, but remains grotesquely misunderstood and misused. So a trigger is defined as anything that elicits thoughts, feelings, and behaviors associated with a previous traumatic event, whether the person is consciously aware of the trigger or not. The emotional response can be fear, panic, anxiety, and agitation. Triggers are always very specific to the individual and relate back to the original trauma experience. So what do you think triggers might be for familial trafficking survivors? Again, you can put those in the chat box. I'm always curious to see what people think. Yeah. So some common triggers, and this is a very long list, right? And I don't expect you to read all this, so I will read it for you, but triggers can be internal or external, meaning they can come from a state within yourself, like within your own body, or they can come from input from the outside world. So the list here is long, and it includes things like not being listened to, feeling trapped, certain smells, very specific noises, bright lights, darkness, surprises, change, being alone, being in a crowd, being teased, feeling hungry or tired, being stared at, people in certain clothes, open doors, closed doors, unlocked doors, or unlocked windows, certain gender presentations, people yelling, people standing too close, a particular time of day or year, authority figures, feeling sick, feeling hot or cold, arguments, having to stay still, hearing from family, being touched, lack of privacy, cameras, being recorded or having your picture taken, unstable housing, or unstable income. Does anything here surprise you? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat box. Yeah. So it's not an inclusive list, and no two experiences are the same. No two individuals have the exact same experience, right? So what might be a trigger for one person might not bother someone else, and vice versa. So when the brain is triggered, it goes into a dysregulated state. And at the time, the primary job for the survivor, and for you, if you are working with the survivor, is to help the brain re-regulate. When a person first exits a trafficking experience, and for familial survivors, that would mean, at least to me, for when they cease contact with their trafficking parent. So typically that would not happen until adulthood. So when the person first exits that experience, they may exist in a constant triggered state. In fact, they have probably never felt calm before in their life, even if they don't realize it, ever. So learning these skills to be calm can be quite impactful. So depending on the state of the trigger can help determine the best strategy to employ in the re-regulation process. Individuals who fall into a fight state might find themselves feeling hot, uncomfortable, angry, aggressive, controlling, demanding, and inflexible. They may resort to blaming, shouting, lying, and manipulating. They may clench their fists or their teeth. They may self-harm. They might mock you or pull their own hair out. They're not trying to be abusive. They're being protective, right? There's a difference. So individuals who find themselves in flight, they might try to run away. They may hide or avoid tasks. They may be hyperactive or overly silly. They may struggle when finding themselves with free time, constantly worrying about what will happen next, or a state of impending doom. I've heard that term too. They may cry easily, begin vomiting, or withdraw socially. Individuals who tend to freeze, they might appear uninterested or bored. They may daydream or have difficulty remaining on task. They may be clumsy. They typically describe feeling disconnected and like they're in a brain fog. They may find themselves staring or rocking. So depending on the state of the brain might determine which brain regulating activity will work best in that moment. Again, with our focus being on combating an under or over arousal of an overwhelmed system, we want to engage the senses with rhythm and try to get ahead of triggers with a flexible schedule, frequent breaks, and lots of sleep. Some suggestions include art, dance, choir singing, walking, biking, massage, journaling, coloring, yoga, drama, weighted blankets, animal therapy, nature, ice, modeling clay, reading books, counting, drinking water, sleep, puzzles, talking, sitting outside, cleaning, and progressive muscle relaxation. So since these are all very specific to the individual, I would suggest that part of the work they do while they are exploring their preferences is to try all of these out and see what they find most relaxing. Fight response can respond well to weight and deep pressure, where flight often responds well to movement. And a freeze response may best be mitigated with swinging or gentle rocking. These are all just rules of thumb. Again, it's individual to the survivor. The amount of time we spend doing these activities, it feels very extreme in the beginning. Survivors just starting their healing journey may have to spend the majority of their days just regulating and re-regulating themselves. Eventually, the time spent having to regulate will decrease, and the amount of time the survivor feels calm will increase. It's not a quick fix. It can take years before the brain says, oh, I'm calm now. So now I return to how you can help specifically. So did anyone have ideas earlier? It seems like whenever I try to open the chat during the presentation, I lose my slides. So I'm not going to do that again. With a focus on progress and not perfection, you can help survivors express and feel their emotions in a safe space. You can remind them to engage in regulating activities as the triggers cause the brain to be unable to recall previously learned skills. Remaining compassionate during your time spent with the survivor is also helpful for them to actually learn the act of self-compassion. You can teach the value of affirmations. So as the survivor will struggle with separating their identity from that provided to them by their trafficker, they will need positive input into who they are as a person. You can provide opportunities for social connection, encourage encounters with nature. We review providing opportunities to discover preferences and strengths. Focus on executive functioning abilities once the brain is calm. And those would be those higher level brain functions that a survivor will not have access to while existing in survivor mode. This includes teaching self-control through problem solving, planning, reasoning, creativity, and flexibility. But again, these are not accessible when the brain is dysregulated, these skills. Humor can also help a lot. Most survivors have a dark sense of humor inspired by their life events, so don't shut this down. It's their way of processing. Help them have realistic expectations regarding their internal emotional state, where bad feelings don't last forever. And help them also understand that problems won't last forever. There are solutions and people to help. They are no longer alone. People and systems are not the enemy. Oh, let me go back. So as a reminder, and I do think I mentioned this briefly before, but let me just restate the importance of delayed narrative memory. As the survivor and you work hard on brain regulating activity, you will start to notice a decrease in the amount of brain fog the survivor has for their own personal historic events. Unfortunately, this process of gaining clarity is traumatic in its own right, as the survivor will have to process what happened to them again and again in order to heal. We sometimes refer to this in pop culture as recovered memories, but this isn't exactly what is happening. It's simply the brain healing and allowing for clarity and access to narrative recall, as well as when you have an increased frame of reference, you may start to categorize events that happened in the life as differently than you did before. So in all of this occurs during a time when the survivor is safe and calm enough to process. But unfortunately, every time this happens, survivor will have to re-regulate their brain, which can get stuck in the new narrative memory, sometimes for days, and that's okay. There is no timeline to healing. However, my experience has taught me that the length of time the brain is dysregulated drastically decreases each time a memory of an event consolidates. It's a good thing and should be celebrated, even if the process does seem chronic in nature at first. So as we help the survivor, we will start to see a shift from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and ultimately to what's right with you. This paradigm shift is so important as it moves the survivor to a place of hope and healing from despair. When we talk about maladaptive behavior, such as self-harming, we're really talking about the person's ability to use behavior to communicate their needs when they are unable to communicate such needs verbally. So we want to take their maladaptive responses or their triggered states and replace them with adaptive responses or brain building skills. And this inspires safety and connection with others. One way we do this is by encouraging reframing as a brain building activity. Reframing is a strategy to look at situations from a different perspective. It involves combating cognitive distortions or false beliefs that you have about the world. And it's also sometimes referred to as fostering a growth mindset, which can go hand in hand with affirmations, another brain building activity. Both of these activities involve retraining the brain to automatically think in an adaptive manner. It's hard work, but it does not take quite as long as you think, so long as frequent repetition is utilized. It's also helpful if the survivor first recognizes their automatic responses to stressful tasks, which are typically found within their internal monologue. Then replacing that automatic response with an affirmation or a reframing activity. Sometimes it's only a few key phrases that need to be reframed, and that will make all the difference in a survivor's life. It's also important that none of these activities feel disingenuous to the survivor's brain. The brain needs to see it as legitimate and realistic for it to take roots. So sometimes when working with survivors, it's your own perspective that needs to be reframed, right? So instead of viewing a survivor as attention seeking, try telling yourself that they are connection seeking. Instead of viewing them as lazy, try telling yourself that they are tired or dysregulated or haven't learned those skills yet. It can be helpful. So when all this hard work is done, we will see the benefits of mind calming strategies. We will see increased productivity, memory solidification, creativity, social engagement, increased focus, attention, and reduction of brain fog. I am at the heart of me a lover of mathematics and formulas. Probably goes back to black and white thinking, but here's my favorite formula is safety and trust-based relationships plus brain calming activities plus brain building activities, and boom, there you have it, resilience, voila. So your ability to bounce back from adversity. Dr. Ginsburg, I don't know if anyone here has heard of him. I hadn't heard of him before I started researching this, but Dr. Ginsburg describes the 7 C's of resilience as making sure that people have in place the tools they need to bounce back, recover, and thrive. Survivors need confidence, which comes from a sense of competent, not from compliments, which are fantastic, don't get me wrong. but survivors need to know that they have a skill set and abilities that they can take pride in and fall back in when times get rough. Times will eventually get rough again, right? Not in the same manner, but life has its ups and downs for everyone. Connection is perhaps the most important C. When we are broken through relationship, we are also healed through relationship. So knowing that the survivor exists within a community rather than in isolation. Character comes next, or an understanding of what is right and wrong. This can be very convoluted coming out of a family that strived on things that were wrong. So really working for justice and building a better, stronger world within the anti-trafficking field or mental health field can help this. And then comes contribution, or having a sense that the world is better because we exist. We want to hear thank yous. Thanks for being here. Thanks for showing up. Things like that. These ideas act as a buffer for maladaptive coping mechanisms like substance abuse and self-harm. And they are sustainable over time, whereas substances and self-harm are just, it's not a sustainable way to go about life, right? You can't get through life that way. I mean, you can, but not well. So control is the final C. Does the individual believe that life is just what happens to them and that they are controlled by others and external forces? Or do they believe that they can control and influence their world and their lives? The International Resilience Project also discusses identification of external versus internal resources as helpful for establishing resilience, as well as combining this with social skills, which are 100% necessary to successfully navigate life amongst a world full of people. So I also want to take a moment, just as I'm about to close up here, to briefly touch on separation from family members, including the trafficker themselves. This is very, very tricky. The fact is that 75% of familial trafficking survivors maintain contact with their trafficking parent well into adulthood. Speaks volumes to exactly how tricky such extraction is. It's typical to see harassment from disbelieving family members, particularly since the victim is kept isolated from non-abused siblings. We discussed that yesterday. During childhood, even within the walls of the family home. The trafficking parent themselves will stalk the victim, easily gaining access to their whereabouts simply by identifying themselves as the parent. In addition, society does a fantastic job of demonizing people who are not quote unquote family oriented. So to combat this, we must normalize separation from toxic family members. This process usually involves a whole lot of grief, which can be buffered by the hope that such a separation is merely a phase in the relationship, at least that with the non-trafficking family members. And then a door can be left open for those family members to later engage with the survivor in a therapeutic setting, perhaps when emotions have calmed down. So even if family members themselves are not toxic, it can be a wise decision to separate yourselves from them, as these individuals can be harassed into giving away your location, the location of the survivor, by a stalking trafficker. So sometimes survivors will choose separation for that reason. Either way, the choice to remain in contact or to break contact is the survivors and theirs alone. They will make this decision themselves when the time is right, and it should never be rushed or forced, but it is very much okay to suggest and normalize such things and be a listening ear during the grieving process. Separation from your family of origin is perhaps one of the most painful parts of this journey. So just to summarize, familial trafficking tends to deter typical brain development due to its chronic and severe nature, as well as the young age of the victim during onset. However, survivors do not have to remain stuck in that survival mode. It's not only possible to recover, it's also possible to thrive following this experience. It just takes dedication, repetition, time, and a little help from our friends.